Daniel Carter sat in his sleek, glass-walled office, staring at the financial reports spread across his mahogany desk. Profits were steady, but customer satisfaction ratings had plummeted. Complaints piled up, long checkout lines, rude staff, expired products left on shelves. Worse, employee turnover was at an all-time high. His board members insisted it was normal in the retail industry, but something about it unsettled him. He leaned back in his chair, the city skyline stretching behind him, and tapped his pen against the desk. Numbers didn't tell the whole story. He had built Carter & Sons supermarkets from the ground up, transforming it from his father's small grocery business into a national chain. But somewhere along the way, he had become removed from the everyday struggles of the people who work for him. The decision came suddenly, but felt right. If he wanted answers, he couldn't get them from boardroom discussions or neatly compiled reports. He needed to be in the trenches to see what his employees faced daily. 2 days later, Daniel stood in the employee locker room of one of his worst-performing stores, staring at his reflection in the scratched-up mirror. He barely recognized himself. Gone was the tailored suit and neatly combed hair. In their place were second-hand jeans, scuffed sneakers, and a faded green uniform polo, slightly too tight around his broad shoulders. He had even let a little stubble grow in, dulling the sharpness of his normally clean-cut appearance. A name tag pinned to his shirt read, Mike Roberts. He adjusted his cap and turned as the door swung open. A stocky man with graying hair and tired eyes walked in, tossing a clipboard onto the bench. "You the new guy?" Daniel nodded. "Carl Henderson, floor manager." Carl's handshake was firm but brief. "We're short-staffed, so I don't have time for pleasantries. You'll be unloading deliveries, stocking shelves, and covering registers if needed. Think you can handle that?" "Yeah, I can handle it," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. Carl gave a short grunt, then gestured for him to follow. As they stepped onto the store floor, Daniel was immediately hit by the artificial brightness of the overhead lights and the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with aging produce. It was a far cry from his pristine corporate offices. The store was barely functioning chaos. Employees moved like overworked cogs in a machine, their faces drawn, their movements hurried. A line stretched from the only open register to the frozen food aisle, customers shifting impatiently, some muttering complaints under their breath. Carl was already walking ahead. Morning deliveries came in late, so produce is a mess. Stockroom's a disaster, and we had 2 call-outs today, so we're running skeleton crew. He glanced at Daniel. "Still think you can handle it?" Daniel ignored the jab and nodded. "Where do you need me?" "Start with stocking. Grab a cart from the back." The stockroom was worse than he expected. Crates of inventory were stacked haphazardly, blocking walkways. The air was thick with dust, and the hum of an overworked refrigerator filled the space. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work, his muscles straining as he lifted heavy boxes. The work was harder than he remembered. When was the last time he had done anything like this? Hours passed, and Daniel pushed through the exhaustion settling into his limbs. He kept his head down, listening. Employees exchanged hushed conversations about late paychecks, broken equipment, and management ignoring their complaints. Every grumble was another crack in the foundation of the company he had thought was running smoothly. As he wheeled a cart of canned goods toward the aisles, he caught sight of the checkout lanes again. The line had only grown longer, and frustration was evident on every face. A woman with 2 young children struggled to keep them calm while juggling a basket of groceries. An elderly man patted his pockets anxiously, muttering about forgetting his wallet. And then he saw her. A young cashier with chestnut brown hair tied into a low ponytail stood at register 3, moving with quiet efficiency. Unlike the other employees, whose faces were set in grim determination, she smiled at customers, her tone gentle even when met with impatience. The name tag on her uniform read, Sophie. Daniel watched as the elderly man stepped up to her register, fumbling through his pockets. His shoulders slumped as he shook his head. "I'm so sorry, dear. I must have left my wallet at home. I'll have to put these back." Sophie hesitated only a second before reaching into her own pocket. Without hesitation, She pulled out a few bills and discreetly slid them into the register. "It's on me today, Mr. Harris," she said with a reassuring smile. "Just pay me back next time." The man's eyes welled up. "You're too kind, Sophie." Daniel's chest tightened. He had spent years making decisions from behind a desk, calculating costs and maximizing profits. But here, in the middle of a store he owned, one of his lowest-paid employees was using her own money to help someone in need. Carl appeared beside him. "She does that a lot," he muttered, watching the scene unfold. "Pays for customers?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet. Carl nodded. "Always the ones who really need it. Doesn't make much herself, but she's got a heart bigger than this whole damn store." Daniel exhaled slowly, something unsettled stirring inside him. He had come here expecting inefficiencies, management failures, maybe even outright laziness. He hadn't expected to find this. An employee who embodied the very values his company claimed to stand for, yet was likely struggling herself. The weight of it sat heavy on his chest as he turned back to his cart of cans. He had come undercover to observe, to understand. But already, he could feel something shifting inside him. This wasn't going to be just another business analysis. It was something more, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what he was about to uncover. Daniel arrived for his second shift with sore muscles and a mind still turning over what he had witnessed the day before. The moment replayed in his head, Sophie slipping her own money into the register to cover the elderly man's groceries. It wasn't just an act of kindness, it was something deeper, something that made him question the way his company truly operated beyond the glossy reports he had been reading for years. The store felt no different than before, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the faint scent of stale bread and cleaning solution lingering in the air. Customers moved between aisles with sluggish frustration, some eyeing the dwindling stock on the shelves. Employees moved with quiet efficiency, but there was no spark, no energy, just survival. Daniel had spent years in boardrooms discussing profit margins, labor efficiency, and corporate expansion. But standing here, dressed as a minimum wage worker, he was starting to see the cracks in the foundation. He pushed a cart of inventory to one of the empty shelves when a sharp voice cut through the air. "You're behind on restocking, Mike. Pick up the pace." Tina Shaw, the assistant manager, stood at the end of the aisle with her arms crossed. Her eyes were sharp, cold, and calculating. Unlike Carl, who carried the exhaustion of someone who cared too much, Tina's demeanor was one of strict authority. "I'm moving as fast as I can," Daniel replied evenly. "That's not fast enough," she said. "We don't have time for slackers here." He bit down his irritation. In his world, people scrambled to earn his approval. Here, he was being treated as disposable. As Tina walked away, a quiet voice spoke beside him. "Don't let her get to you. She only cares about making numbers look good." Daniel turned to see Sophie stacking boxes onto the shelf next to him. Even in the dim lighting, he could see the exhaustion in her features, the faint shadows beneath her eyes. "I noticed," he said. "She always like that." Sophie gave a short laugh. "Worse on days when corporate is breathing down her neck." "Which is most days." Daniel watched as she worked. There was a methodical grace to her movements, but there was also something else. Something weighed heavy on her shoulders. "Carl said you help customers a lot," he said carefully. She hesitated for only a moment before shrugging. "People have bad days. If I can make it a little easier, why wouldn't I?" He considered that. "That money comes out of your paycheck, though." Her expression faltered, but she quickly masked it with a small smile. "I get by." Daniel wasn't convinced. He saw the way she adjusted the hem of her uniform, the fabric slightly frayed at the edges. He noticed the way she held herself, shoulders squared, but with an underlying stiffness that spoke of someone used to bearing burdens alone. Before he could say anything else, Carl's voice carried through the store. "We need an extra cashier up front." Sophie sighed. "That's my cue." Daniel watched her go before turning back to the shelves. Every interaction, every observation was painting a clearer picture, one that made his stomach twist with unease. By the time he made it to the break room, the atmosphere was thick with quiet grumbling. A few employees sat at the rickety table, eating hastily packed meals. A teenage stock boy scrolled through his phone, a deep crease in his forehead. Another worker leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Lisa, a mother of two who worked double shifts, sat with her head in her hands. Her apron was stained from hours of handling produce, and the exhaustion in her posture was unmistakable. "Long day?" Daniel asked, sitting across from her. Lisa let out a humorless laugh. "Every day's a long day." She pushed a crumpled bill around on the table with her fingers. "Had to call my babysitter again to stay late. There goes my lunch money for the week." Daniel frowned. "They don't pay overtime?" She snorted. "Only if we're officially scheduled for it. If we get asked to stay late last minute, it's off the books." Daniel clenched his jaw. That was illegal. Lisa sighed. "Honestly, though, even if they paid it, it wouldn't be much. I make just enough to not qualify for assistance, but not enough to actually live." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Sophie entered the room, grabbing a bottle of water from her locker. Lisa looked up and forced a smile. "Hey, tell your brother good luck on his test tomorrow." Sophie brightened slightly. "I will. Thanks." Daniel waited until Lisa stepped away before speaking. "You have a brother?" Sophie nodded, twisting the cap off her bottle. "Yeah, he's in high school. Smart kid. Wants to go to college, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "But money's tight," Daniel finished. She sighed. "It's fine. He'll get there, one way or another." Daniel's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He had spent years building a company that was supposed to support hardworking people like Sophie and Lisa. Yet here they were, barely scraping by. Tina suddenly appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Break's over. Back to work." The tension in the room thickened. Employees grabbed their things without a word. As Daniel stepped past Tina, she narrowed her eyes at him. "You might want to move faster, Mike. I don't tolerate dead weight." Her words didn't bother him. What did was the realization settling in his bones. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was a system designed to wring every drop of energy from its workers while giving them nothing in return. And for the first time, Daniel Carter found himself questioning everything he had built. The store pulsed with a restless energy as another long shift dragged on. The checkout lines were packed, shelves sat half empty, and customers grew more irritable by the minute. The weight of exhaustion hung over the employees like a thick fog, each of them moving with the mechanical precision of people who had long since stopped expecting things to get better. Daniel kept his head down, stocking shelves as he listened to the conversations around him. Frustration simmered beneath every exchange. Complaints about broken freezers that never got fixed, hours cut without warning, and management pushing harder without offering anything in return. He had heard enough to know this wasn't just a bad day. It was the reality of working here. Sophie barely stopped moving. She bounced between registers, ran price checks, and helped bag groceries when the lines grew overwhelming. Even as the stress mounted, she still managed to treat each customer with kindness, her patience never wavering. But Daniel could see the cracks. The way she pressed her fingers to her temples when she thought no one was looking. The way she rolled her shoulders, trying to ease the tension from standing all day. And then it happened. A woman with 2 small children reached Sophie's register, her face tight with worry as she placed a modest selection of groceries on the conveyor belt. Bread, milk, a few canned goods. Essentials. She clutched a handful of crumpled bills, counting under her breath. The total flashed on the screen, and she bit her lip. "I'm sorry," she murmured, pulling out a box of pasta and setting it aside. Then a bag of apples. The little boy at her side tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Sophie hesitated, her hand hovering over the register. Daniel saw the moment she made her decision. Without hesitation, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a few bills, and discreetly slipped them into the till. "You're all set," she said softly, giving the woman a reassuring smile. The woman's eyes filled with tears. I can't." "It's fine," Sophie insisted, voice gentle. "Have a good night." It should have ended there. It would have if Tina hadn't been watching. The sharp clap of heels against the tile was the only warning before Tina descended on the register like a vulture. Her expression was sharp with triumph, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped. Sophie's head jerked up, her face draining of color. "You're stealing from the company," Tina said, voice cutting. "You know the policy. No paying for customers. No handouts." Daniel felt something inside him snap. "It's not stealing," he said, stepping forward before he could stop himself. Tina turned on him, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." Daniel forced himself to hold back the fury rising in his chest. She was helping a customer, a mother trying to feed her kids. Tina scoffed. "That's not our problem. We're not running a charity. If people can't afford food, that's their issue, not ours." A few customers had paused, watching the scene unfold. Employees shifted uncomfortably, looking between Sophie and Tina with wary expressions. Sophie swallowed hard. "I just wanted to help." "Well, you can help yourself right out of a job," Tina said coldly. "You're fired." Silence fell over the store. Sophie stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I can't lose this job," she whispered. "Please, Tina crossed her arms. "You should have thought of that before you broke the rules." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. His cover didn't matter anymore. The disguise, the quiet observations, none of it meant anything in the face of what was happening right now. "You can't do this," he said, his voice low but steady. Tina raised a brow. "Oh, and why not?" Daniel took a step forward, his voice carrying through the store. "Because I own this place." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. For a moment, no one reacted. Then Tina let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "Excuse me." Daniel reached up and pulled the name tag from his shirt, letting it drop onto the counter. The room seemed to shrink around him as every set of eyes turned his way. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said, looking Tina directly in the eye. "I own this company, and you're the one who's fired." The color drained from Tina's face. Her mouth opened, then closed, as if she were scrambling for something to say. You're lying," she finally stammered. Daniel pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his ID. "I think you know I'm not." The shift in the store was palpable. Employees straightened. Customers murmured. The power dynamic that had been so firmly in Tina's grasp cracked and crumbled before everyone's eyes. Sophie was staring at him, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. Daniel turned to her, his expression softening. "You're not fired. In fact, we need more people like you in this company, not less." Tina sputtered. You can't just." "I can," Daniel interrupted. His voice was calm, but firm. "And I will." Tina's lips pressed into a thin line, her face burning red. But she saw it, the finality in his expression, the realization that she had lost. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the store. Silence stretched for a long moment before a slow clap broke through the tension. Carl stood at the end of the aisle, arms crossed, a small smirk on his face. The clap grew, spreading through the store until it became applause. Daniel exhaled, finally feeling the weight in his chest begin to lift. Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. "You're really the CEO?" Daniel looked at her, his expression solemn. "Yeah, and I've got a lot of work to do." The store had never been so quiet. Even with customers lingering at the registers and employees shifting uncertainly in the aisles, the weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Daniel felt it too, the tension, the disbelief, the slow realization that everything had changed in a single moment. Sophie still looked stunned, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as if she needed something solid to hold on to. She searched his face for any sign that this was some elaborate joke, but the truth was plain in his expression. "You're really him," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I am." Carl, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, let out a low whistle. "Well, that explains a lot." The employees who had been watching from a distance exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Some of them looked wary, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. They had spent years under the rule of people who never saw them, never cared. What made Daniel any different? He turned to them, his voice steady. I came here because I wanted to see what it was really like. Not from a boardroom. Not from numbers on a spreadsheet. I needed to understand what this company actually is, not just what I thought it was. No one spoke, but the way they listened told him they wanted to believe him. Daniel shifted his gaze back to Sophie. You shouldn't have to pay for a customer's groceries with your own money. She straightened. Someone had to. A pang of guilt struck him. He had built a business that was supposed to help people. Yet here she was, forced to carry a burden that never should have been hers. Carl cleared his throat. So what happens now? Daniel let out a slow breath. That was the question, wasn't it? He had spent years obsessed with growth, with numbers, with expansion. But for what? If the people working for him couldn't afford to live, if customers were forced to choose between feeding their kids or paying rent, then what had he really built? Things had to change. He turned to the employees who had gathered. This store, the way it's run, it's not right. The long hours, the lack of support, the way you're treated, it's unacceptable. And I take responsibility for that. Some of them looked surprised. Others simply nodded, as if they had been waiting for someone to finally say it. Daniel exhaled, pushing forward. Starting immediately, wages are increasing. No more off-the-books overtime, no more cutting hours without warning, no more choosing between keeping a job and doing the right thing. A murmur rippled through the group. Skepticism, hope, disbelief. Lisa, the exhausted mother from the break room, crossed her arms. Talk is cheap. You can say all that now, but what happens when you go back to your office? When corporate gets involved? Daniel met her gaze. This isn't just talk. I'm overhauling the policies from the ground up. There's going to be transparency, real benefits, and actual support for the people who make this company run. And I'm not waiting to get approval from corporate. Lisa studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. We'll see. Sophie spoke up next. And what about the customers? What about the people who come in here and can't afford the basics? Daniel had already been thinking about that. We'll set up a fund. A company-backed initiative to help people in need. And we'll work with local organizations to make sure no one who walks into one of our stores has to leave empty-handed. The weight in his chest loosened as he said the words. He had spent years trying to build something successful. It was time to build something meaningful. Carl smirked. Well, boss, looks like you've got your work cut out for you. Daniel nodded. Yeah, and it starts now. The store wasn't perfect. The problems wouldn't be fixed overnight. But as Daniel looked at the faces around him, some wary, some hopeful, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.